Good morning and welcome to Chapter a Day. We're reading from Home Again, a Door County novel, and we are currently on Chapter 3. Robert Oakley was the kind of man who needed a woman, and sometimes several, in his life to make it complete. He wasn't a ladies' man. He only loved one woman at a time, and then with his whole being. Robert simply loved to have women around. Unfortunately, every woman he loved in a I want to hitch my star to yours until death do us part kind of way had up and died on him. There were two exceptions to that. His second grade crush, who was still happily married to her husband of 40 years, and his meddlesome pastry chef, who never missed an opportunity to remind him why he was still single. That's not to say he didn't have women in his life whom he looked after and loved. He did, two of them. Poppy Hansen, whom he'd taken under his wing after her divorce from a man unworthy of her, and her daughter Astrid, who was still a baby at that time. Robert remembered Poppy as a teenager. She used to hang around with Garrett and her brother Leaf, Garrett's first real friend when they moved to Fish Creek. Poppy had been fearless then, always smiling, always on some adventure, which usually involved bruised arms, legs, and a trail bike or a toboggan or some other piece of sporting equipment most people used without the peril Poppy seemed to find. When Mark Meadows, Poppy's ex-husband, got done with her, Poppy was in her early 20s, tired, and she no longer had smiles for everyone. Her fearless adventuring was a thing long past. Seeing such a vibrant woman shrink into a distrustful shell tore at Robert. It hurt almost as much as losing Garrett when he left home and never came back. So Garrett reached out. He offered her a job. Robert could see Poppy's expression when he asked her if she wanted to come and work for him at the Red Robin Inn. The look she gave him was etched in his brain and on his heart. Part hope, part fear, and the smallest spark of the enterprising, I can do anything I put my mind to, spirit she exuded growing up. And Poppy Hansen was still exceeding his expectations every day. If anything, she worked too hard, which was hard to do in the hospitality industry. Just then, a tiny whirlwind of energy who owned his heart blasted into his office. She brought all that was right with the world and more than a few dandelions. She presented them to him every spring morning because his office needed cheering up. Astrid put the dandelions in the vase she made for him in kindergarten, which he kept on his desk right next to a photo he'd taken of Garrett at Garrett's first book signing. He'd had to use a telephoto lens, but he managed to capture Garrett in an unguarded moment, smiling, like he used to when he was a child. "Grandpa Robert, guess what?" Astrid said after jamming the dandelions into the vase. "What?" "Uncle Leaf's painter let me prime the walls in the Bluebell cottage." "Prime the walls?" Robert asked, smiling as Astrid grabbed the photo of Garrett, came around and plopped herself on his lap where he sat behind his desk. Astrid nodded. "Yep, I got to wear a mask and everything. I primed him. I did a good job, too. Big John said so." Big John ran the hardware store in town. He was a retired professional painter who took so much pride in his work that if it wasn't done right, he did it again. He also loved kids. Robert wished he'd given Astrid a hat. Her white blonde hair was covered in specks of light blue primer. "I'm sure you did an excellent job, sweetheart." "That's what Big John said." Astrid cocked her head at him as she looked from Garrett's photo to Robert and back again. "How come Garrett isn't here helping with the building? Everyone else is helping." Poppy had suggested the construction of the Red Robin's newest cottages. They were standalone, self-catering units, each with a different Door County theme, and all done in bright beachfront colors. The construction was almost complete on the last 2 cottages. Garrett lives in New York, Astrid. That's too far to come and help with painting. Astrid scrunched up her brow. If he lived here in the house Uncle Leaf keeps clean for him, would Garrett help? Astrid had no idea how that innocuous question pierced Robert's heart. Probably not. Garrett's a very busy man with his own life to lead. Too busy to help his dad? Astrid asked, sounding like a tiny prosecutor spoiling for a fight. That thought cheered Robert tremendously. He gave her a gentle squeeze. When he didn't answer her, Astrid set the silver-framed photo on his desk. I think you should put Garrett in time out. Sons should help their dads build things. It's like a rule. Robert laughed. I can't put Garrett in time out, Astrid. He's a grown man. You can't put your mom in time out, can you? He asked, sure that his logic was sound. I'd like to. I'm not a baby. She should be letting me take care of my dog. I'm beginning to think mamas don't know what's best. How she jumped from the cottage building to pet care of a pet Astrid didn't have, had Robert rubbing his head. Before he could formulate an answer regarding the stray dog Astrid wanted very much to adopt, she jumped off his lap and headed toward the hall. When a 7-year-old friend made it that far, she turned around and gave him a parting piece of parenting advice. You should have put Garrett in time out when he was little, she said, bending her chin down a bit. In that moment, she looked like an admonishing octogenarian giving sage grandma-like pearls of wisdom. If you put Garrett in time out when he was little, then he'd probably be helping us build right now. And then she smiled and skipped out of the door to find her dog or some other bit of mischief, no doubt. Robert was really going to have to get that dog to the vet, then give it a bath. It wasn't going away, and neither was Astrid's devotion to it. All the adults in her life were just going to have to get with the program. Robert picked up the photo of Garrett and put it back in its spot next to the drooping dandelions. She's right, you know. I should have nipped your distancing in the bud when I had the chance. A niggling of a plan started to present itself. It wasn't a great plan. It wasn't even a very good one. But it would be proactive. Robert had already written the letters, piles of letters, to Garrett, starting the day he put his second wife in the ground. Garrett had been unreachable then. Robert had no answers for Garrett or for himself. He'd been to a therapist who suggested the letters. She said it was important for Robert to write them, even if he chose to never show them to Garrett. Robert followed his therapist's advice. He'd written sometimes more than once a day, sometimes only once or twice a week, but he never stopped writing. He would make copies and send Garrett all the letters, by the boxload. He'd inundate Garrett with love and kindness. Not that all the letters were filled with kindness, they weren't, yet every one of them was written with a loving heart. Robert couldn't make Garrett read them, but he could, sure as the day is long, show Garrett a day didn't go by that Robert didn't think about him. Robert sent the first box of letters that day, and the last before all the finishing paint was done on the last of the new cottages. The simple act of sending the letters started a fire all its own in Robert's heart, steeling his resolve to do everything he could to have a meaningful relationship with his son while there was still time to do it. He would no longer sit idly by, waiting for Garrett to come home. He was going to start his own version of the Oakley timeout. Astrid was right. Parents didn't always know what was best for their children. Children, especially adult children, sometimes needed a timeout to figure out what was best for them and that their parents still mattered. On that hopeful note, Robert sat down at his desk and penned a thank you note to Astrid. It would be the first of many notes Robert planned to write to Astrid. The last note would be written in a light, spidery script on the day he would die, many, many years from now, long after Astrid had children of her own that she'd inevitably put in timeout. Thank you for spending time with me, and tomorrow we'll go to chapter 4. Have a wonderful day.